In 2019, a researcher at the University of Vienna drilled into a petrous bone recovered from a necropolis just outside Rome. The petrous bone is the densest bone in the human body, sitting deep behind the ear, preserving DNA for thousands of years in conditions that would destroy every other biological trace. The powder extracted from that tiny fragment was sequenced, analyzed, and compared against thousands of other genomes, ancient and modern. And what it revealed contradicted almost everything we assumed about who the Italian people really are. For generations, Italians believed they knew their story. They were the descendants of the Romans who built the roads, the aqueducts, the empire. That story felt unshakable. It wasn't. What ancient DNA has uncovered is not a bloodline. It is a 12,000-year archaeological site of human migration, 5 seismic demographic ruptures, each one rewriting the genetic identity of the peninsula completely. For most of the 20th century, the story of Italy was told through language, pottery, and written records. It was a clean story. Romans spoke Latin, an Indo-European tongue that spread across the Western world. The Etruscans spoke something else entirely, a language that linguists still cannot fully decipher despite decades of trying. The Greeks colonized the south, founding cities like Syracuse and Naples. The Gauls settled the Po Valley in the north. And after Rome fell, the Lombards and other Germanic peoples swept in from beyond the Alps. The narrative was tidy, it matched the archaeology, and it made intuitive sense. Underneath all of it sat one foundational assumption, that modern Italians were more or less the genetic descendants of the Romans who built the roads and the aqueducts, that the deep biological identity of the peninsula had been established during antiquity, and that everything which followed, the Lombard conquest, the Norman invasion of Sicily, the Arab Emirate, was cultural overlay sitting on top of a stable genetic foundation. Nobody seriously questioned it because nobody had the technology to test it. Italy's regional differences reinforced the narrative perfectly. The visible distinctions between a Neapolitan and a Milanese were understood as ancient tribal echoes stretching back to the Iron Age. Northern Italians descended from Gauls and Lombards, Southern Italians from Greeks and native Italic peoples. Sardinians were a world apart, isolated on their island since antiquity. Every piece seemed to fit. But that last detail, that nobody had the technology to test it, is precisely the mechanism that allowed the assumption to survive unchallenged for so long. Before ancient DNA extraction became reliable in the mid-2010s, population genetics could only work with modern samples. Researchers took blood from living Italians, compared genetic marker frequencies, and tried to infer backward through time. The fundamental problem with that approach is that it cannot distinguish between two very different histories that leave similar modern signatures. A population that stayed put for 3,000 years and one that was replaced twice, but landed in a similar genetic range, look nearly identical when all you have is the endpoint. Early mitochondrial DNA studies compounded the confusion rather than resolving it. A study published in 2007 compared ment DNA from modern Tuscans to Anatolian populations and found a striking match, which seemed to confirm Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who had claimed the Etruscans migrated from Lydia in modern Turkey. That finding rippled through popular science media. The Etruscans were Anatolian immigrants. The father of history was vindicated. Case closed. Except it was not closed. Mitochondrial DNA traces only the maternal line, mother to daughter to granddaughter, one thin thread of ancestry that ignores everything carried by fathers and misses the vast majority of the genome that actually defines a population's profile. Using mtDNA to reconstruct population history is like trying to understand an entire city's demographics by interviewing one person per household and only asking about their mother's side. You might catch a signal, but you are missing almost the entire picture. The tool that finally broke the problem open was whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA pulled from petrous bones, that extraordinarily dense fragment lodged deep behind the inner ear. Because of its remarkable density, it can preserve usable genetic material in remains that are 8,000, 10,000, even 12,000 years old in Mediterranean climates that would normally degrade DNA within centuries. When researchers began applying this method systematically across the Italian peninsula, the clean story didn't bend under the pressure of new evidence. It disintegrated entirely. To understand what the DNA revealed, you have to start at the very beginning, not with Rome, not with the Etruscans, but with the people who were there first. Modern humans reached the Italian peninsula roughly 45,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets buried much of northern Europe under kilometers of frozen silence, Italy served as one of the refugia where small bands of hunter-gatherers survived the cold. When temperatures finally rose and the ice retreated, it was partly from these Italian refugia that human populations re-expanded northward, recolonizing a continent that the ice had emptied. These were Europe's original inhabitants, foragers who had lived on the peninsula for tens of thousands of years, shaped by its landscapes, its coastlines, its particular rhythms of survival. Then, around 8,000 years ago, everything changed for the first time. Neolithic farmers, originating from Anatolia and the Near East, arrived on Italian shores and began spreading across the peninsula. This was not a gentle blending of two ways of life. Across Europe, the farming transition involved a near-total replacement of indigenous foragers by incoming agricultural populations, and Italy was no exception. The earliest farming sites appear in Puglia on the southeastern coast, and from there the agricultural frontier spread both northward along the Adriatic and westward toward the Tyrrhenian coast. Within a few centuries, the genetic signature of the original hunter-gatherers had been reduced to a minority component, typically around 15 to 25% of the genome. A population that had survived an ice age that had outlasted conditions brutal enough to wipe out most of human Europe, was genetically overwhelmed not by war or catastrophe, but by the slow, relentless arithmetic of farming communities outbreeding foraging ones. But one place was largely spared. Sardinia, difficult to reach by sea and far enough from the mainland to avoid the casual migration constantly reshuffling coastal populations, was bypassed by most of what followed. Modern Sardinians remain to this day the closest living Europeans to those original Neolithic farmers, a genetic time capsule surrounded by blue water, preserving in their DNA a portrait of what early European farmers looked like before the next wave arrived and changed everything again. Because another wave was coming. The second rupture arrived during the Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago, when populations carrying ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea, began moving into Europe in one of the largest migrations in human prehistory. These were mobile pastoralists who rode horses, worked bronze, and spoke the ancestor of nearly every European language alive today. Their genetic fingerprint spread across the continent with extraordinary speed, and Italy was no exception. Research confirmed that steppe-related ancestry reached northern Italy by approximately 2000 BC and had penetrated into central Italy by 1600 BC, carried in part by the Bell-Beaker cultural complex, a widespread archaeological phenomenon associated with distinctive pottery, metalwork, and, as ancient DNA now reveals, a very specific genetic profile. By the time Rome was traditionally founded in 753 BC, Central Italians already carried roughly 30% steppe ancestry. They had been genetically transformed twice, first by Anatolian farmers, then by steppe pastoralists, before a single Roman road had been laid or a single Roman law written. 2 complete population overwrites in 4,000 years, and the story was only just beginning. Of all the mysteries that ancient DNA was expected to solve in Italy, the Etruscans ranked highest. Here was a civilization that had dominated central Italy for centuries, built extraordinary cities, pioneered art forms that the Romans would later absorb and claim as their own, and spoken a language so alien to everything around it that modern linguists still cannot fully decode it. The question of where they came from had haunted researchers since antiquity. Herodotus had his answer. The 2007 mitochondrial study seemed to confirm it. And so, when an international team led by Cosimo Post at the University of Tübingen set out to sequence ancient Etruscan genomes directly, the expectation in the field was that they would finally put the Anatolian origin theory on solid genomic footing. They found nothing of the kind. The 2021 study analyzed 82 ancient genomes drawn from 12 archaeological sites across Etruria and southern Italy, spanning almost 2 millennia of burial evidence from 800 BC to 1000 AD. The researchers were looking for the Eastern Mediterranean genetic signal that Herodotus had described, and that the mtDNA study seemed to support, some ancestral thread connecting the Etruscans back to Lydia, to Anatolia, to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Instead, they found that the Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from the Latins living in nearby Rome. Same proportion of steppe ancestry, same Neolithic farmer foundation, same overall profile. Let that settle for a moment. Two civilizations separated by a radically different language, distinct religious practices, entirely different artistic traditions, and different burial customs, and virtually identical DNA. The people who spoke the great unsolvable language of ancient Italy were, at the genomic level, the same people as their Latin-speaking neighbors. Post told Science magazine directly that the Etruscans looked indistinguishable from their Latin neighbors. The Herodotus theory was not weakened or complicated by this finding, it was demolished. And the 2007 mtDNA study that appeared to confirm it? That result now stands as a textbook example of what happens when researchers build a grand narrative on one thin strand of evidence and assume it represents the whole rope. But the Etruscan finding opened a question even more unsettling than the one it closed. If the Etruscans carried steppe ancestry, and steppe ancestry is associated across the rest of Europe with the spread of Indo-European languages, why did the Etruscans speak something that was emphatically not Indo-European? Every other population across Europe that absorbed significant steppe ancestry ended up speaking a language from the Indo-European family tree. The Etruscans were the exception that refuses to resolve cleanly. David Caramelli at the University of Florence offered the most compelling explanation. The Etruscan language predated the steppe arrivals and was simply resilient enough to survive the genetic turnover. New populations moving into Etruria did not overwrite the existing culture, they assimilated into it. Genes changed, language persisted. The biological identity of the Etruscan population was gradually transformed, while the cultural identity held firm. That explanation is plausible, even elegant, but it makes an uncomfortable point with extraordinary sharpness. The assumption that genetic ancestry predicts cultural identity, the assumption that underwrote decades of population history and made the Herodotus theory feel so satisfying, is precisely the kind of shortcut that produces beautiful narratives and wrong conclusions. The Etruscans did not come from Anatolia. They were already there, and what replaced them genetically left their language, for a time, completely intact. That discovery was striking, but it was not the most disruptive finding in the dataset. That distinction belonged to what happened next. What the DNA revealed about Imperial Rome is, by any measure, the most dramatic finding in the entire dataset. It is the kind of result that makes researchers check their methodology twice, then a third time, before accepting that the numbers are simply telling the truth. During the imperial period, beginning around the 1st century AD, the genetic profile of people buried in and around Rome underwent a transformation so profound that it registered as one of the largest ancestry shifts documented in European history outside of the original Neolithic transition. The ancestry composition of Central Italian populations swung heavily toward the Eastern Mediterranean. Post's team quantified it at approximately 50% admixture with Eastern Mediterranean populations. A separate study led by Margaret Antonio and Jonathan Pritchard at Stanford, analyzing 127 ancient genomes from 29 archaeological sites in and around Rome across 12,000 years of continuous habitation, captured the same signal independently. People interred in Imperial era Rome looked genetically less like their own Iron Age predecessors and more like contemporaries living in Syria, Lebanon, and Western Anatolia. The city that built the Colosseum codified Roman law and constructed the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had ever seen was, in biological terms, as Near Eastern as it was European. The mechanism was the empire itself. At its peak, Rome controlled territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, governing roughly 70 million people. Slaves poured into the capital from the eastern provinces. So did freed people, merchants, soldiers completing their service, administrators, and craftsmen drawn by opportunity in the largest city in the Western world. The critical detail is geography. The eastern Mediterranean was far more densely populated than Gaul, Hispania, or Britannia. The net demographic flow ran consistently westward toward Rome, and this was not a trickle spread across centuries. The genetic data suggests it was rapid enough to reshape the city's ancestry profile within a few generations. Rome did not merely conquer the East moved to Rome. A 2025 study published in Genome, Biology, and Evolution by researchers at Oxford pushed the timeline back even further. The Eastern Mediterranean genetic signal was already appearing in Central Italian individuals dated to the late Republican period, roughly 200 years before the empire formally began under Augustus. The shift was underway during the Punic Wars, during the conquest of Greece, during the annexation of the eastern provinces. Ancient DNA was tracking Roman military and economic expansion more precisely than any surviving historical text. Three things lock this transformation into place beyond reasonable doubt. First, the Eastern Mediterranean ancestry shift appears simultaneously across multiple independent burial sites in and around Rome, replicated by different research teams using different sequencing platforms, different reference populations, and different statistical models. This is not a fluke of one cemetery or one study. Second, that consistency rules out contamination, modern admixture, and sampling bias. It also rules out the idea that Imperial Rome remained genetically Roman in any meaningful Iron Age sense. Third, and most profoundly, it implies that the genetic identity of a civilization is not fixed by its founders. The Romans constructed institutions that would shape the Western world for millennia, but the people living under those institutions were in constant, dramatic flux. Within 300 years of imperial expansion, the genomic distance between an Imperial Roman and an Iron Age Roman was comparable to the distance between modern populations in entirely different countries. The Romans built an eternal city. They did not build an eternal people. And when the empire finally collapsed, another wave was already forming beyond the Alpes. When Rome fell, the peninsula did not stabilize. It absorbed another wave. In 568 AD, the Lombards crossed from Pannonia into northern Italy, beginning a conquest that would reshape the political and, as ancient DNA now confirms, the genetic landscape of the peninsula for centuries to come. The Lombards were a Germanic people, and for a long time historians debated whether their arrival represented a genuine mass migration or simply a change of rulers, a military elite imposing itself on an existing population without fundamentally altering its biological composition. Ancient DNA has settled that debate decisively. A 2018 study published in Nature Communications analyzed Lombard burials in both Hungary and Italy and found strong genetic similarities between the two groups, confirming that this was a genuine folk migration. Families included, not merely soldiers and commanders, but entire communities relocating across the Alps and establishing themselves on Italian soil. Lombard males carried Y chromosome lineages characteristic of northern and central European Germanic populations, particularly subclades associated with populations far to the north and east of the Italian peninsula. These were not Italians with Germanic rulers. These were Germanic people who had become Italians over generations. But here's the detail that matters most for understanding modern Italy. The Lombards did not reach everywhere. They controlled Lombardy, Tuscany, parts of the center, and the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento in the south. But they never took Sardinia. They never fully controlled most of Sicily, Calabria, or coastal Puglia, regions that remained under Byzantine governance, maintaining their connections to the Eastern Mediterranean world that Imperial Rome had already drawn so deeply into the peninsula's genetic fabric. This uneven coverage was not merely a political footnote. It carved a genetic fault line directly through the Italian peninsula, one whose traces are still measurable in modern DNA today. The legacy of Greek colonization deepened that divide further. Beginning in the 8th century BC, Greek settlers had established colonies along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily on such an extraordinary scale that the Romans later called the entire region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Syracuse became one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Naples, Taranto, Reggio Calabria all began as Greek foundations. These were not trading posts or seasonal outposts. They were full-scale settlements with temples, theaters, and governing institutions, and their populations intermarried with local Italic peoples across centuries of shared life. Recent DNA analysis has confirmed that this colonization left a significant and lasting genetic signature that survived not just the Roman period, but also the Arab Emirate in Sicily, the Norman conquest, and 5 centuries of Spanish rule. When researchers mapped the genetic structure of 1,616 modern Italians, drawn from all 20 administrative regions in a 2019 study published in Science Advances, what they found was remarkable. Italy contains the largest degree of genetic population structure detected in any single European country. 3 distinct clusters emerged with clarity: northern Italy, including Tuscany; southern Italy, including Sicily and the central southern regions; and Sardinia, standing entirely apart from both. Southern Italians are genetically closest to modern Greeks, a legacy of Magna Graecia, centuries of Byzantine governance, and deep Eastern Mediterranean connectivity stretching back through the imperial period. Northern Italians cluster with Spaniards and Southern French, reflecting both the deeper penetration of steppe ancestry and the later addition of Germanic Lombard elements. And Sardinians preserve a genetic profile closer to Stone Age farmers than to almost anyone else alive in Europe today. The genetic distance between a Milanese and a Sicilian is modest in absolute terms, but it maps precisely onto 12,000 years of differential migration history, layer by layer, conquest by conquest, wave by wave. Not everyone in the field accepts the full weight of these findings. Some researchers argue for continuity. The basic genetic framework of the Italian peninsula, they suggest, was established by the Bronze Age, and everything since has been adjustment at the margins. The Eastern Mediterranean influx during the imperial period was concentrated in Rome and its immediate surroundings. The Lombards were a thin ruling elite, not a mass migration. The deep biological structure of the population endured. It is a position that has the appeal of restraint, the careful scientist resisting the temptation to overdramatize what the data shows. But it becomes increasingly difficult to defend against the actual numbers. 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture in imperial-era central Italy is not adjustment at the margins. It is a population-scale transformation. If half of your genome is now derived from a different part of the Mediterranean than it was 4 centuries earlier, the word continuity is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. And the Lombard migration, once dismissed as elite imposition, has now been confirmed through ancient DNA as a genuine population movement, with families in tow. Calling either event marginal requires looking past the very data that revealed them. A 2024 study on the Piscine culture, published in Genome Biology, adds another dimension to this question. Researchers sequenced individuals from Adriatic Central Italy, spanning more than 1,000 years from the Iron Age through late antiquity. Despite the Picines having a culture distinct from both the Etruscans and the Latins, their genetic profile was remarkably similar to both. The Iron Age Italian peninsula, it turns out, was culturally fragmented but genetically cohesive, multiple identities built on one biological substrate. That finding only makes the imperial era disruption more striking. A genetic unity that had survived centuries of cultural competition was shattered within a few hundred years of imperial expansion and the demographic forces it unleashed. And then there is the Etruscan language paradox, which refuses to resolve cleanly even now. If the Etruscans carried steppe ancestry, and steppe ancestry correlates across the rest of Europe with the spread of Indo-European languages, why did the Etruscans speak something that was not Indo-European? The most plausible explanation, that the language predated the genetic arrivals and proved resilient enough to absorb them culturally, is elegant. But it drives home a point that the entire Italian genetic story keeps returning to. The assumption that genes predict culture, that biological ancestry determines linguistic and social identity, is not just occasionally wrong. In the Italian case, it is wrong enough to have misled the field for decades. What remains genuinely unknown is how uniform the imperial era genetic shift was beyond Rome and its immediate surroundings. The vast majority of ancient Italian DNA comes from a handful of well-excavated sites in Lazio and Tuscany. There are fewer sequenced genomes from Calabria, Puglia, Campania, or the deep interior of Sicily. If the Eastern Mediterranean influx was concentrated in urban centers along major trade routes, the story is one of localized cosmopolitanism. If it was peninsula-wide, it rewrites even more than current research has established. A 2025 study on Bronze Age remains from Calabria found that even before Rome, the Deep South had already diverged genetically from the North, showing closer affinity to Sicilian populations and lacking Eastern genetic influences already present in Sicily at the same period. The peninsula was never a single genetic unit. It was always a patchwork of microregions, each shaped by its own specific pattern of contact and isolation, carved out by mountains, river valleys, and access to the sea. The clean story was never clean. It was simply unexamined. Stand at a bus stop in Rome today, and you are standing on 12,000 years of genetic layering. Ice Age survivors sheltering in Mediterranean refugia. Anatolian farmers who crossed the sea and rewrote the continent. Steppe pastoralists riding out of the grasslands north of the Black Sea. Empire that drew Syria and Lebanon and Egypt into the genome of its capital within a few generations. Germanic Lombards descending from the Alps. Every wave still present. Every layer still measurable. Italy was never a bloodline. It was always a crossroads. The technology capable of reading these layer hours has existed for less than a decade. The next petrous bone pulled from an Italian necropolis could rewrite this story again. That is not speculation. At this point, it is simply the pattern. And if the descendants of Rome's founders were already a different people within 300 years, what does that tell us about the stories every nation tells itself about who it really is?